Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. It's been a while, but I think it's time to do a new mini PC review. I used to review a bunch of these things on this channel, but I've kind of slowed down over the years, mostly because there's not a lot of new things that come out with them. I think at this point, most of us know what to expect from a mini PC. It's going to be relatively small and you can maybe put it under a TV or on your desk, and it'll likely have integrated graphics, but it will allow you to play some pretty good PC games and then also a lot of emulation. And so I have slowed down with these reviews, mostly because I wait until something really piques my interest, because then I think it's going to be an interesting review, like the one we're going to do here today. Now, for the most part, the things that do get my interest have to be of one of three different categories. Usually it'll be something about like the form factor, maybe it's super small, but then I also like to test performance. So maybe it's got the next generation of chip, or it's got discrete graphics, and so I like to test those as well. And then finally, I also like to look at additional functionality. So for example, if it's got a new camera or fingerprint sensor, those are the kind of things I like to test. Well, it just so happens that in today's video, we've got a device that is kind of two of three categories. And this one is called the MinisForum X7 Ti. Now, this is actually part of a new high-end line from MinisForum. They're calling it AtomMan, so it's kind of a sub-brand, if you will. And the first thing that drew me to reviewing this device is the chipset. So it has the Ultra 9 185H, which is the latest Meteor Lake chip from Intel. And so we are going to test performance with that chipset, but then also it has an OCuLink port, so we'll also test it with an external GPU. And then finally, it also has a couple features that I thought were worth testing. The first is that it has an integrated webcam, so you'll be able to use this to directly log into the computer with your face, but then also you can use it like with webcam stuff as well. And then also there's a unique 4-inch touchscreen on this device, which will allow you to look at things like metrics, but then also set it to a clock if you would like as well. So we're going to kind of test all that stuff together, and there were just enough things that were interesting to me that I thought it might be worth your time as well. Now, when you put it all together, you'll find that the sum of the parts is not quite as good as you might expect. In fact, there are some design choices that I thought were pretty bad from MinisForum, and then also that Intel chip is just kind of underwhelming as well. Either way, I'm getting ahead of myself, but let's go ahead and just dive into this review and start testing everything out. Okay, to start, let's go over some of these specs with the X7 Ti, and there are quite a few things that are worth noting. And like I mentioned, it's got that top-of-the-line Intel Core Ultra 9 processor. It's got a total of 16 cores and 22 threads, and a turbo frequency of up to 5.1 GHz. And it has those Intel Arc graphics, which are still relatively new and untested. Other specs worth noting include DDR5 dual-channel RAM, as well as two different M.2 slots for storage. One is 2280, and the other is a smaller 2230. And this is one of those rare mini PCs that has a full-sized SD card slot if you wanted to use that for expansion as well. We've also got some pretty great features like Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, and 4 different ways for video out: HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 2.0, and then 2 different full gigabit USB 4 inputs. And then finally, we've got that square 480 by 480 4-inch display right there on the front. Now, like I mentioned, this is part of a new sub-brand from MinisForum, which is supposed to be their top-of-the-line devices. And right off the bat, you can see that the prices are relatively top of the line when it comes to MinisForum as well. For a bare bones version, which means it won't come with RAM or storage, it's $670. However, I think that most customers will opt to have them include the RAM and storage, which comes with 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage, but it's going to bump up that price to $850. And as far as mini PCs with integrated graphics go, this is one of the most expensive I've ever seen at launch. To put it into perspective, one of my favorite mini PCs from late last year was this one from MinisForum. It was called the UM780XTX. This one had a similar form factor and size and also an OCuLink port. It didn't have a touchscreen on the front, but it was $200 cheaper, and that's with 64 gigs of RAM versus 32. And so right off the bat, I've got a couple things in mind when it comes to that $200 difference. Is the screen and the webcam really going to be worth that extra money, or is the performance between last year's 7000 series of Ryzen versus the latest Ultra 9 going to actually be worth that $200 as well? And so already the X7 Ti has a bit of an uphill climb compared to other mini PCs that have been released by MinisForum themselves. Either way, let's go ahead and move on to the unboxing, and in full disclosure, this was sent over from MinisForum for review, but no money was exchanged in any way. All opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this ahead of time. The box is relatively plain with just a couple different features specified here in pictures, but let's go ahead and open it up and take a look inside. So let's start with this stand, which is made out of metal and pretty sturdy, and I like the fact that you can actually rotate the angle, which means that you can get it just right there on your desk. Further down in the box, we have our power supply, which is rated for 120 watts, and also has a barrel plug to it. It also comes with a pretty thorough instruction manual that will walk you through all the different components of the PC and how to take it apart if you'd like as well. Let's do a couple first impressions, starting with this front screen. And right off the bat, I noticed that it is quite reflective, almost glassy in its texture, which does make it look pretty premium, but probably going to be pretty smudgy. And as you can see near the top, you've got a couple different holes. So one of these is the camera, and then we also have a couple mic inputs as well. Now, one interesting thing about this mini PC is that even though it has rubber feet on the bottom, I don't think it's intended to actually lay down flat because the fan intake is here on the bottom as well, and these rubber feet are relatively thin. And so if you were to lay this on a desk, I don't think it would get sufficient airflow. And so I did find that to be unusual in that it does seem to be designed to only be used with the stand. And I think the I/O design also kind of lends itself to the fact that it's supposed to be on the stand. Up top, we have our air exhaust as well as the power button. And when you conceptualize the design like this, that means that all of the ports are going to be on the left and right. And if we actually look at when it's plugged in, I don't think it's the best design in the world. In fact, it looks pretty garish and ugly. So here's just a really typical setup. On the left side, I've got my Ethernet cable. I've also got a USB dongle for the keyboard input, and then also my HDMI port. Below that, we also have the power barrel plug. So all these things I would consider to be rather standard when it comes to plugging it in. And I would say the right side is relatively typical as well for most use case scenarios. So I've got a wired controller input here with USB-A. This is plugged into a GameSir controller. And then also I've got a USB-C solid state drive connected here with all of my games loaded up. And so I would say from a typical use case perspective, this is probably what most people would have plugged in. And yeah, it looks a little bit weird to have all these wires on the left and right side. At best, I would say it's a cyberpunk style, almost like a Kmart version of the Matrix. And at worst, I would say this is a mini PC that almost looks like it's on life support, like it's just hanging in there with a bunch of IVs plugged into it. And so this is one of the biggest takeaways I had when doing my testing, is that when I have everything plugged in, I found it to be actually a pretty ugly design altogether, and I'm not sure why MinisForum went this route. It almost feels like the engineers put it all together and their design department was on holiday, and so they didn't have any input and they just shipped it like this. Either way, I hope I've done enough to demonstrate what the expected look is going to be like with this mini PC, so let's actually move on to the I/O and the functionality of it. So let's start with what I would traditionally call the back, but on this device it's the left side. Here we've got our barrel plug input and then our two video outputs, HDMI as well as DisplayPort. Up top we've got USB 3.2 Gen 1 as well as a USB 2.0 port. Next we've got two 5 gigabit Ethernet ports, and to the right of that we've got a USB 4 port capable of 40 gigabits per second. And then finally, always happy to see an OCuLink port, which will allow us to get really fast eGPU speeds. Next, we'll take a look at the top, and first thing here is the physical shutter button that we have here that we can slide across to cover up the camera. Speaking of which, let's test the camera and mic inputs of this mini PC. Hello, let's test the mic and the video here real quick. So I have the AC going on the other side of the room, so you might pick up on that with the audio mic. But then also the video camera, it says it's 1080p, but I don't know, this quality doesn't seem to really be fitting that for me. I'm about 2.5 feet away from the camera right now, which I think is what it would be like if you had this on your desk and you're using it as a webcam. So it's cool that there is a webcam option, and obviously you can sign into the computer with your face as well, which is always handy. But yeah, the quality itself is not going to be great, but it could work in a pinch. Okay, also up top, we've got our power button, which also is a fingerprint sensor, so you can just touch on this to log into your computer. And then finally, on the right, we've got our SD card slot for expanded storage. Next, moving over to the right side of the mini PC, we've got a BIOS or UEFI reset button, as well as two different USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. After that, another full-speed USB 4 port, and then a microphone headphone jack. And that's really about it when it comes to I/O. On the bottom, we also have some air intake, same thing with the very back. Next, let's talk a little bit about repairability as well as cooling. You can see here on the top left, we do have a little slot here that allow us to open up the back compartment, but it will require you to remove some screws first. And in order to get to those screws, you have to remove the rubber feet. And unfortunately, this is something that MinisForum does pretty often, in that you have to pull apart these stickers just to access the screws. That means that if you were to do this often, that these stickers would lose their stickiness, which I think is kind of a bummer. Either way, once you've got these screws removed, it's pretty easy to leverage the back open and you can get inside. And first thing you'll see is a relatively large CPU fan, which basically covers everything else up. So in order to get to anything else, you will have to remove the fan as well. And we've got an additional 12 screws that we have to remove in order to access everything below, which I think is a little bit overkill. Either way, once we get inside, we can pull apart the fan and we can see that, yeah, there's a lot of cooling here as well. In addition to a large heatsink, we've got a bunch of copper pipes too. So let's talk a little bit about cooling and the overall power performance, and we're going to use Cinebench 2024 as our example. Here on the left, I'm running core temp, which will allow us to see all the different temperatures and power profiles of the CPU. And as we run the test, you can see that the power is going to max out at about 60 watts altogether. And it will keep that steady 60 watt going in CPU power for about 5 minutes. After that, it's going to throttle it down to about 55 watts. Now, in terms of temperature, I found it to stay relatively cool, usually around mid 70s Celsius, which I think is pretty great for a small form factor PC. There were a couple cores that got into like the low 80s and one that bumped up to like a low 90 at one point, but for the most part, everything stayed relatively cool, and I don't think that the throttling down to 55 watts from 60 had anything to do with temperature. I think it's probably just programmed to do that after a few minutes of turbo boosting. Either way, I was pretty happy with the performance here in terms of just the overall CPU wattage that were afforded here with this mini PC form factor, but then also it kept the temperatures relatively cool. And for anybody who likes the numbers, I got a full score of 958 points on the multi-core bench. And of note, when at idle, the CPU would usually run around 8 watts altogether. So either way, I've got no complaints when it comes to cooling. I think this is actually one of the highlights of this mini PC. Now, doing some further investigation, we have 2 different RAM sticks down below. And these are covered with a thin metal sheet, which I assume is maybe supposed to be a heatsink, but mostly some sort of shield from the fan. And it's not too hard to pull this metal sheet off, but it is a little bit destructive, so it's not something I would recommend doing very often. Either way, I did pull mine off just because I am testing this mini PC, and I did verify that it is running DDR5 RAM, 16GB sticks, running at 5600 megatransfers per second. And this is the recommended top RAM speed with this chipset, so I think they are really pulling out all the stops. Now, to the left of that, we have another large heatsink, and this is covering the M.2 drive, so if you wanted to get into the storage, that's where you would do it. And so wrapping it up in terms of repairability, I would not give this a very high score. I don't like the fact that you have to get so far into the device just to access the RAM and the storage, and even then, you've got to remove like heat shields and heat sinks in order to even get to those parts. And so if you do plan on getting a bare bones model, I think that's something worth keeping in mind. So overall, I would say it's not super hard to get inside this mini PC, but not quite for the faint of heart. Okay, next I want to transition to talk a little bit more about the size of the mini PC and the experience of using it, especially with that touchscreen. And I would say, just in terms of averages, it's about a middle-sized mini PC. It's about 2.5 sticks of Kerrygold butter, or if you want something a little bit more practical, it's about the size of an Xbox controller, at least in terms of width. It's a little bit taller, but I think this will help you get an idea of how large it is overall. Now I want to talk a little bit about this screen, because this was, again, one of the things that really drew me to reviewing this in the first place. And one of the things I really liked about it was the ability to be able to change performance profiles on the fly using the touchscreen. We've got 3 different options. We've got energy saving as well as balanced and performance mode, but I found that in practical use, this is not as easy as you might think. To start, it's not a very responsive touchscreen, so you have to be very deliberate about where you're going to touch and when. In addition, I found that these performance modes don't really seem to be doing anything within the software, at least right now. At first, I thought that these power profiles would adjust things like TDP, so you could lower it down if you wanted to not pull as much power, but then also crank it up if you really want to do some gaming. However, when actually doing benchmarks, like the TimeSpy score here from 3D Mark, I saw that these scores were basically identical between the 3, no matter what profile I used. There is a little bit of variance between the numbers, but I think that's pretty typical of just running benchmarks. And so really, it doesn't look like performance-wise we're getting any sort of difference between the 3 different power modes. And so next I thought, okay, maybe it doesn't have to do with performance, power, and TDP, but rather the amount of cores that are turned on and off, and the overall power plan within Windows. However, when looking at the power plan options within Windows, there's only one, and it's balanced. So instead of having an energy saving and performance mode, we've only got one option here. And so again, I'm not really sure what these performance modes actually do with the touchscreen, because in terms of just actual gameplay performance and everything else, I couldn't find a difference when actually toggling between them. Now, moving on to the rest of the touchscreen, I was equally disappointed. Even though there are readouts for CPU and GPU and RAM and SSD, you can't actually touch them or do anything with this data. The only things you can actually do is toggle between a clock function, and then also you can increase the brightness and the volume of the mini PC itself. And this also led into its own little rabbit holes. For example, you can reduce the brightness of the screen, but it won't actually turn the screen off. And this again was one of those things that was kind of a pain when actually using the touchscreen. Adjusting the brightness and the volume with your finger was really hard to do just because it wasn't very responsive. There's also a USB function button that you can tap, but all this will do is tell you which port is which, and I don't think that's very helpful either. So it turns out the only thing I really enjoyed from this touchscreen was changing out the different clock faces that we have. There's a few different options, and none of them are customizable, but I think that they do look pretty good. In the end, I found the metrics that they were measuring here within the touchscreen just to be unintuitive. I don't really need to see how much of the CPU and GPU are actually being used. I'd much rather see something like the power draw or the frames per second, which again is not something that's part of this touchscreen interface. And so overall, even though this is one of my main draws, the idea of having a touchscreen interface to be able to interact with as you're using your mini PC, it ended up being one of my least favorite aspects altogether. And finally, to confirm, yeah, this thing is a fingerprint magnet. Okay, now that we've got a pretty good idea of the overall hardware and the experience of using it and the good and bad that comes with it, let's actually start talking about performance and what it's like to actually game on this mini PC. So we'll start with a quick video playback test. So what I like to do here is play at a full 4K unscaled resolution and then watch how many frames are going to be dropped from playing a 4K movie on YouTube. And typically what'll happen is when you first start up a video, you'll get like 5 or 10 drop frames, but after that, it's going to kind of settle into its performance and then it'll be steady from there. And that's pretty much the same thing that happened with this mini PC, other than the fact that it kept dropping frames the longer I watched. Now, in the grand scheme of things, I think that the number of drop frames with this mini PC is relatively inconsequential. We're talking about 40 drop frames among 10,000 frames altogether. And so we're not talking about something that's really going to be affecting performance, and I don't really think a human eye could perceive that anyway, but it was something worth noting because most other mini PCs I've tested over the past couple of years don't continue to drop frames as you're watching. This one was pretty steady about it, and it would drop a frame here and there every few seconds. And so in the end, I do think this device will be just fine for 4K playback, but it was one difference worth noting. Either way, let's go ahead and start focusing on gameplay because that's the number one thing I like to do with these mini PCs. We'll start with some lightweight games first. So here we're playing Hades at a 1080p default settings, and you can see that it's running well over 150 frames per second. So I think if you wanted to use this with lightweight PC games, it's going to be absolutely fine. But at $850, I think that's a lot of overkill. So let's move on to something a little bit harder. We're going to start with what I call Xbox 360 era games. This is going to be BioShock Infinite running at 1080p in high settings. And yeah, we're getting a steady 60 frames per second right here. So I think other games from this era, including Fallout 3 and New Vegas and Skyrim, as well as the Halo Master Chief Collection, these are all going to play just fine. So let's move on to what I call like previous AAA games. We're going to start with Doom Eternal. This one can get a pretty steady over 60 frames per second. So I would just lock this at 60 with 1080p medium settings, and I think you'll have a great time. It's pretty close when it comes to Control as well. With 1080p low settings, this one can almost reach 60 frames per second, but more like 55. I think in this case, I would probably lock it at 50 and just enjoy it from there with a very smooth frame rate. Moving along to Rise of the Tomb Raider, again at 1080p in low settings, I'm looking at an average of about 40 frames per second as I'm playing one of the more in-depth scenes in the game. So again, definitely nowhere close to 60 frames per second, but absolutely playable. It's a similar story with Death Stranding, again at 1080p in low settings, and I got between 45 and 50 frames per second. So again, not a perfect 60 frames per second, but definitely still a very good experience. Let's move on to more games that people are playing right now. So we'll start with Destiny 2, one of my favorite games of all time, 1080p low settings, and I got an average of about 50 frames per second. Personally, I prefer to play this game at 60, so I would consider dropping this down to 720p instead of 1080p if you want to make sure that you have very smooth gameplay. Next up, we have Elden Ring. This was pretty consistently over 30 frames per second, except for in the heat of battle. I saw it drop down to about 22 frames here and there. And I think this is one of those games where you don't want the performance to affect your actual gameplay. And so this may be one that you would want to play at 720p instead of 1080p. And also, please don't judge my terrible gameplay of playing Elden Ring. Next up, we have Baldur's Gate. I saw this one get an average about 40 frames per second, again at 1080p low settings. I would find this to be perfectly playable. And then finally, our last test case is going to be Cyberpunk 2077, 1080p low settings with XeSS 1.2 turned on, and I saw an average between 35 and 40 frames per second. Again, I think when it comes to most PC games, depending on what you consider to be playable, you'll probably have a pretty good time. Next, I want to test an external GPU using the OCuLink port. We're going to use the GPD-G1 as our example. I made a whole video about this. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to see the difference between playing with or without an eGPU in this case. Either way, this one has the Radeon RX 7600M XT GPU inside. That's a laptop GPU, but it does give a pretty healthy boost to your PC gaming. So let's do a few examples. We'll start with Cyberpunk 2077, this time at 1080p and high settings, and I'm seeing an average of about 90 frames per second, as opposed to 35 or 40 with lower settings previously. It's almost an identical experience with Baldur's Gate 3, again 1080p high settings and an average of 90, maybe 95 frames per second. Still a really great experience. But I would say the game that benefited the most from having an eGPU was Destiny 2. Now we're at 1080p high settings and getting an average of about 130 frames per second. So that's almost a 100 frames per second jump. However, bear in mind that we're only using a mobile GPU, so this is kind of like turning your mini PC into a full-fledged laptop with discrete graphics. However, that OCuLink port gives you a lot more room to work with, and MinisForum has been thinking about that as well. They just recently announced what they're calling the DEG1 eGPU dock. And so this is a desktop GPU dock that can be used with OCuLink, which is very rare within this space. And so the idea here is that you would bring your own GPU and power supply, connect them to this dock, and then plug it directly into your mini PC, including the one we're reviewing here today. And the pricing on this is $100, and I think that if you have a GPU laying around that you'd like to use with a mini PC, this might be a really excellent setup, especially because you can upgrade it with other GPUs down the line. In addition, if you want to upgrade to a different mini PC that also has an OCuLink port, you'll be able to do that in the future too. And so overall, I like that MinisForum is being forward-thinking about this eGPU dock, and I'm going to try to get my hands on one of these and try to do a full review of it as well. Anyway, that's about it when it comes to PC gaming. If I had to summarize it, I would say that you can play just about any game on this mini PC with varying results. So if you're okay with 1080p and maybe 30 frames per second, then a lot of these games are going to be fully playable. So next, let's move into my bread and butter, which is going to be emulation. Now, because this device is quite powerful, we're just going to start at GameCube and then push our way up from there. In addition, I'm going to try to upscale things to 4K when it comes to emulation, especially with like GameCube and PS2. So here I'm running Dolphin at a 6x upscale, which is well beyond 4K, and yeah, most games play absolutely fine. The only game that I had to drop down in upscaling was Rogue Squadron 2, one of the hardest GameCube games to play. This one I had to drop down to a paltry 5x upscale, which is still 4K. It's a similar story with PS5, although this one I had to keep at a steady 5x upscale for most games, so one below the GameCube. However, the vertical height pixels were still well over 2160, so I would consider this to be 4K as well. And so for the most part, if you wanted to play GameCube and PS2 at a 4K resolution, you're going to be able to play most games, even the really hard ones like Champions of Norath. The only PS2 game that gave me some trouble was God of War 2. This one I had to play at a 4x upscale to get a steady 60 frames per second, which is still well above a 1440p resolution. Moving on, I wanted to try out 3DS emulation because this can sometimes cause some issues with this emulator in certain chipsets, but I found that this actually ran really well at a 4x upscale using the March version of Citra. It's a similar story with Nintendo Wii U. I found that most games played absolutely fine, including Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, as well as New Super Mario Bros. U, playing at 1080p 60 frames with no problem. The big test for Nintendo Wii U is always going to be Breath of the Wild. This one I upscaled to 1080p and tried to run it at a full 60 frames per second. It didn't quite get there. It was very close, I would say closer to about 55 frames per second when you're actually in an action scene. Let's keep moving and really push performance. We'll start with PlayStation 3, and I did find that from a performance standpoint, this was really impressive. I'm playing all these games at a native resolution, but after just compiling some shaders for a couple minutes, I found that just about every game that I could throw at it was very playable. When you start moving into the more heavy-duty 3D action titles, something like Prince of Persia, it's not going to play at a full 60 frames per second, but it's still well over 30 and very playable. And same goes with even harder games to play like Infamous. This one stayed well above 40 frames per second almost the entire time, so I think this would be a really great game to play on this machine. However, I did run into a couple complications when it came to emulation. We'll start with Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This one was pretty consistently at 60 frames per second, but I did find some rendering issues. For example, the water here in this scene just looked a little bit off. I don't remember it looking so bad when I had emulated it previously. It's a similar story with God of War 3, usually the hardest game that I have to test within my PS3 catalog. This game did play pretty consistently at 30 frames per second or above, so I would consider this to be performance-wise at least playable. However, I did find that in later scenes, some of the shadowing was just really off, and so this may not be a very enjoyable experience just from the graphical issues. So I would say that PS3 is mostly playable on this machine with some graphical glitches here and there that you may have to work with within the settings. Now let's switch gears and talk about some of the Microsoft systems. We'll start with the original Xbox, and unfortunately I found that the performance here was quite terrible. I'm just running these games at a native resolution, and even then they cannot keep up at full speed. Now this is something that I saw previously with other Intel chips, including on the MSI Claw, so I'm not very surprised. But it is disappointing that you probably aren't going to be able to play any Xbox games with any good speed or graphics at all. And much like it was with the MSI Claw and the 155H chipset, we're getting the exact same problems here when it comes to Xbox 360. I saw an average of about 10 to 15 frames per second, which renders basically every game unplayable. Not only that, many games, including Forza Horizon, would just outright crash as you were playing it. And so, unfortunately, I would not consider Xbox or Xbox 360 to be playable at all. And then finally, for those who are a little bit more adventurous in their emulation performance, let's do a little bit of switch testing. Here I found that performance was pretty impressive, but I also saw a lot of graphical issues with the latest forks of the Yuzu emulator. For example, I could play Metroid Prime Remastered in docked mode, and I thought it was very playable, except for when you rolled into a ball, because you had a bunch of different glitches on the screen, which took away from the overall experience. Same thing with Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. I thought that the performance here was pretty great, other than the fact that a lot of shadowing textures were just not showing up. Other games like Xenoblade Chronicles was just glitching out a bunch, and so I would consider this to be pretty terrible. And so at best, I would say that Nintendo Switch emulation on this chipset is relatively hit and miss. I tried out both Sudachi as well as Ryujinx, and they both had very similar issues, so I think this is more of a chipset thing as opposed to an emulator thing. And given the fact that emulation in general with Nintendo Switch has slowed down quite a bit over the past 6 months, I'm not sure how long it'll be before everything starts to look good. So long story short, if you planned on buying this machine for Nintendo Switch emulation, I don't think now is the time to do that. Okay, I think we're at a good spot when it comes to testing. Let's now move on to the summary and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the X7 Ti. As always, we'll start with the good stuff, and I've got a couple notes here. The first is that cooling is pretty great on this machine. I saw an average of about 75 degrees Celsius even when pushing it pretty far. I also love the fact that it has an OCuLink port, because I think it expands its use cases significantly, especially when you think about other accessories that are coming down the line, like a desktop eGPU dock. I also appreciate that we have 2 different USB 4 ports. That allows us to plug in things like SSDs with really fast speed, but you could also use that with Thunderbolt if you have a different eGPU as well. I also think that overall PC gaming performance was a highlight on this mini PC. It basically played every game that I could throw at it, but you did have to make some compromises here and there when it came to graphical fidelity or resolution, or at the very least the frames per second. Either way, I could find myself being pretty happy with playing PC games on the X7 Ti. But as you probably already figured out, there are quite a few things I don't like about this PC, so let's go through these down the line. The first thing I want to talk about is just that the design choices don't make a lot of sense to me. I get the fact that they maybe wanted to put it on a stand just to give it a smaller footprint, but I think it really limits your options, especially when it comes to the I/O and the different ports. When you start plugging everything into it, you have a very sleek mini PC that transforms into something that just looks like it's on life support, and so I didn't really like the look of it overall. Not only that, I don't like the fact that it doesn't seem to be designed to lay down flat either. I'd rather have the choice than not. I also think that MinisForum could have done a better job when it comes to making this mini PC easier to repair. I appreciate that I can still access the RAM and the storage, but I don't like the fact that I have to remove so many components and screws to get there in the first place. I was also disappointed with the high-end emulation performance on this PC, which kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that they are using a relatively new Intel Arc chipset. And so it may be that years down the line, this will actually perform better once the emulation development teams are able to kind of get everything up to speed, but until then, I just don't think it's going to be worth it when it comes to high-end emulation. I was also pretty disappointed in this overall touchscreen experience. I was hoping to be able to see things like frames per second right there on the display, or at the very least to be able to customize the readouts of what I wanted to see on the screen. Unfortunately, you're just kind of stuck with the metric that they decided were the best, or you can just change it to different clock faces. And then finally, the biggest sticking point for me is the fact that it is so expensive. $850 for this mini PC, I just can't seem to find where it actually makes sense. If you look at my mini PC spreadsheet, which I will leave linked down below, you can see that this is on the high end when it comes to price. In fact, this is the 4th most expensive one that I've ever covered. And the thing to keep in mind is that all the other expensive mini PCs that I've covered all had discrete graphics cards, which means the performance was way above what we're testing here today. In fact, the performance here is about equal to other mini PCs that cost about $200 less, but with AMD chips. Which leads me to a conclusion that, yeah, using the latest Intel chip was probably not a smart move, given the fact that they are so expensive, but then also, performance hasn't really caught up either, especially when it comes to emulation, given the fact that we have all sorts of graphical glitches with systems that run great on the latest Ryzen chips. When it comes down to it, I just have a really hard time finding a use case that makes sense with the MinisForum X7 Ti. This is a mini PC that is expensive without the performance you would expect at that price point, but then also is a little bit ugly, and some of the functions I thought were really great just really didn't pan out either. So when it comes down to it, I think if you're in the market for a mini PC, MinisForum is a great place to shop, but I would look at some of the other offerings they have within their catalog, some of which I actually have here for review. Anyway, you'll see those videos here pretty soon. Let me know what you think of this video down below. It's been a while since I've done a mini PC review, so I'm always happy to hear whether or not you liked it. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.